Well, welcome and thank you for joining us today. We're going to start on a new adventure as we kind of go a little bit deeper. What I really felt led of the Lord to do is to look back at one of the narratives that we read about in David's life back in 1 Samuel. Look at that and then take a look into the Psalms that he wrote about those events that transpired. And this really built upon what God has been doing through our messages the last few weeks. So last Sunday we had a message of seeing the bigger complexity of God's love and taking everything into account. In our midweek devotional, we looked at things are not always as they seem. And kind of putting those two ideas together, I think we can see this really played out in a narrative and one that's a little bit confusing that we read about with David. So I think if we get the narrative down and understand that, and then as we take a look at the Psalms, things will start to really come together for us. So this message is going to be more of a kind of laying down the foundation of kind of building the framework of remembering the narrative that was going on, and a lot more of our application and the connecting the dots should come in the messages that follow. So the narrative that we're going to be looking at spans about 3 chapters. It's from 1 Samuel chapter 20 and then kind of goes all the way through chapter 23. So we're not going to read all of it, but I'll kind of paraphrase the basics of the account and kind of read out some key components that we read into the narrative. So it starts off with David learning that Saul wants to kill him. And Saul has a son named Jonathan, and Jonathan is best friends with David. And upon hearing Saul's plans to want to kill David, Jonathan steps in and intercedes for David and says, "Dad, you can't do this. David has been faithful to you, he's loyal," and he changes his father's mind. But time passes and Saul decides he wants to take David's life again. And David gets word of it and he flees and hides from Saul. And he meets his friend Jonathan and he tells him, "Your dad is seeking my life." And Jonathan has a hard time understanding this, saying, "Well, my father always talks to me about what he's going to do and seeks my counsel. If he was going to take your life, David, I would know it." And David warns him and says, "Your father knows that you have loyalty to me, and that is why he's not telling you." So they devise a plan to try to determine whether Saul is really going to, or is really seeking David's life or not. And so they decide that David's not going to go to a multi-day festival that Saul has, and that when Saul notices he's gone, David says, "If he becomes very angry and upset, you'll know that he had plans to kill me. But if he's okay with it, then I'm wrong." And so they do that, and so Jonathan, on the second day, answers his father's question. His father Saul says, "Where's David at?" Jonathan says, "Oh, he wanted to go celebrate with his family, so I told him to go and do that." And Saul becomes furious over this and reveals that he wants to destroy David. And so Jonathan goes and he warns David that yes, the things that he was thinking were true. And so they part ways. And we learn a lot through this narrative of the relationship with Jonathan and David, seeing the loyalty and the friendship that Jonathan had for David. And later on, after all the events that we're going to talk about today, Jonathan comes back to David. And we read of this in 1 Samuel 23 in verses 15 through 18. David saw that Saul had come out to seek his life. David was in the wilderness of Ziph at Horesh. And Jonathan, Saul's son, rose up and went to David at Horesh and strengthened his hand in God. And he said to him, "Do not fear, for the hand of Saul my father shall not find you. You shall be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you. Saul my father also knows this." And the two of them made a covenant before the Lord. And David remained at Horesh, and Jonathan went home. I bring this up because we see a great character in Jonathan here. Jonathan was next in line for the throne. Once his father Saul was to pass away, Jonathan was going to become king of Israel. But Jonathan didn't hold to that. He recognized that God had chosen David to be king, and so he put aside his kingship and said, "No, David, this belongs to you." And so much so he says, "I will be your right-hand man. I will be there to support you all the way." Now, sadly, Jonathan's going to pass away before he's able to fulfill this desire to be at the hand of David. But we see his heart and the friendship. And that's going to come into play in the next few weeks as we look at everything that's transpired in David's life, to remember this friendship that he had with Jonathan and this loyalty. So David, we're going to back up the narrative now. All right, Jonathan had warned him of his dad wanting to destroy him, and so David flees. And he flees to an area where they are worshiping God. And he meets Ahimelech. And we read of this in 1 Samuel chapter 21. And Ahimelech sees David coming, and he goes out and meets David with trembling into him. And we might be kind of wondering, well, why is Ahimelech so nervous as David comes and approaches him? And it's the understanding that David was the commander of the royal bodyguard of Saul. And so this would be a strange thing to have the commander of the royal bodyguard coming without an escort or without Saul. And so Ahimelech is a little bit nervous here of what is going on. And so he's apprehensive of what news David is bringing or what deed David is going to be doing. And when he gets there, this is what we read of David telling him in verse 2 of 1 Samuel 21. And David said to Ahimelech the priest, "The king has charged me with the matter and said to me, 'Let no one know anything of the matter about which I send you, and with which I have charged you. I have made an appointment with the young men for such and such a place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever is here.'" So David is asking for food from Ahimelech, saying, "Hey, is there any bread in this place?" And Ahimelech tells him, "No, I don't have any common bread. All I have is the showbread that's inside the tabernacle, the place of the worship of God. And this bread was only there for the priest to be able to eat when they put new showbread out." But Ahimelech decides, after asking David some questions about him and his men, to give him the bread that is there for them to eat, that only those priests were allowed to eat. And Jesus brings up this occurrence in Matthew 12, 1 through 8. And we've talked about this before. But just to remind you of what Jesus says there, is he brings this up on when people were criticizing him and his disciples for eating on the Sabbath day. He brings up what David did and saying, wasn't this okay to do? And when the spirit of the law is fulfilled, even though the literal interpretation of the law seems to be violated, God brings out there's a difference sometimes. And that's when he brings out to him, "I wish you knew what was meant by desire mercy over sacrifice." That there's times that human life is more valuable than the law. And why is that? Well, because the law is there for, many times, the well-being of human beings. And so that's why the well-being of human beings can trump the literal reading of the law. They were used to, if an animal fell in a pit on the Sabbath day, they weren't to do any work, but they recognized that they could rescue that animal. Or if a human being was injured, they could rescue them. Obviously, they had a little bit of problems when Jesus would perform miracles on the Sabbath day, but they understood the physical well-being of human beings. And so there's times that you trumped it for the well-being of a human being, and Jesus brings up this example for that as well. Let's go in here. So David ends up having the holy bread, and he's going to take it to some of his men that he has as well. Now, in verse 7, we read of a little side tidbit of information here, that there is this certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before Yahweh. His name was Doeg, the Edomite, the chief of Saul's herdsmen. So, Doeg is here detained before the Lord. We're not told why he's detained before the Lord. It could be that he's made a vow, which makes it so he can't leave for a certain time. He might have became unpure for some reason, and so for a purification rite, he has to stay there so long so the priest can keep an eye on to him. We're just not told exactly why he's detained, but it gives us insight of why David probably does the things he does even though Doeg is there. We're going to find out later that David recognized that he was there, that he was from Saul's special party, but he just wasn't leaving, and so David didn't have a lot of time, and so even though he was there, he still goes through this process. Doeg is an Edomite. That's important for us to know because he, being an Edomite, means he was a close relative to the people of Israel. So if we remember back in the lineage of Israel, God chose Abraham. Abraham had a child, Isaac. Isaac then had 2 children, Esau and Jacob. Jacob's name is changed to Israel, and that is who we have the tribes of Israel come from. So it was with Esau and Israel that the nation, or that God started using all the descendants of one individual. Esau, his descendants became the Edomites. And so they're very close relations. So God, in his word, always expected the Israelites and the Edomites to take care of one another. And it was only when God was judging one of the nations for usually what they did wrong to each other that they were allowed to attack one another. But for most cases, it was they were to look out with one another because they were relatives. So this is important in this narrative because Doeg is going to end up doing some nasty things that we're going to find out. So it's specifically telling us his responsibility as an Edomite, being a close relative there. So then it goes back into the narrative with David and Ahimelech, and David asks Ahimelech if he has a weapon that he can use. Because David, again, he's fleeing from Saul. He has no weapon. So Ahimelech says, no, I don't have anything except for the sword of Goliath that was taken. It's sitting behind in a cloth behind the ephod. That's all I have. Go ahead and take that. And it wasn't wrong to take something from a tabernacle. Obviously, David's the one that dedicated it there. There was ways to get that object back. Usually there was a payment that was involved with that as well, but not really breaking any major Levitical laws with this one. It's interesting that it tells us the details of behind the ephod. That's important for David to know as he's going and maybe searching for it, or if the priest wouldn't get it. But for the reader, it's not that important of detail. So we have to ask ourselves, why did the Holy Spirit find it important to tell us that the sword was behind the ephod? And we can't be dogmatic on this, meaning we can't be for sure. But it is interesting the ephod was usually in connection with ascertaining the Lord's will. Because the breastplate where the Urim and the Thummim would be on the priest that was used to determine what God's will was attached to the ephod, which was basically 2 shoulder plates that were there. So there's that connection. So it seems like the author is trying to tell us that the Lord's hand is in on what David's doing. Again, can't be dogmatic on it, but it is interesting that this ephod is brought up in this passage. So David's response is, there's none like that, give it to me. And I think of how encouraging this must have been to David to get Goliath's sword. Goliath's sword would have been a memorial for God's provision of what he's done before in David's past. And that must have really uplifted David's heart. Have you ever done something where a reminder has come up to you in the midst of trials or depression or whatever it might be? Maybe you're having a really bad day and you happen to be cleaning something up and you find maybe your baptismal certificate. And it kind of just brings back the memories of being on fire for the Lord and what he's done for you in your past and the thrill you had of wanting to take that next step to be baptized. And it uplifts your spirit of what you're going through, the moments of remembering what it's like with God on your side, even though you're in the midst of a trial. And that had to be what it was for David to be. He's fleeing from Saul. There's all this danger going on, worry, anxiety. And the sword that is the only one that is there available is Goliath's sword. That reminder of what God has done for him in the past. And I think that's why David says there's none like it. Not so much in the splendor of the sword, but what it probably meant to David personally. So with that narrative, we find that David gives a lot of lies here. And we don't know David's heart for the deception he gives. He might have deceived Ahimelech because he just wanted to get his way and thought, if I lie to him, he'll give me the things that I want. Or David might have deceived Ahimelech because, again, as we see later on, David knew Doeg was there and that he was probably going to stir up trouble. And it's possible that David lied to Ahimelech to try to protect Ahimelech, knowing that he's going to be questioned about helping David out. And so if David tells him a lie, Ahimelech can be righteous and stand there and say, this is what David told me. He said he was on a secret mission for you. I didn't know he was running and fleeing from you. That I was helping out a fugitive in that account. So again, we can't be dogmatic on this. We can't pick what David's heart was at this time because we don't read it in this context. But it helps us to navigate. Maybe there's some different ideas of why David is doing what he's doing. But again, we don't find when Jesus references this as this being a negative thing that David did when it comes to getting the bread. And that is really where most of the lie comes into play. And it seems like God steps aside for a second the mandate to not bear false, it's not really false witness, lying here, in order to get things, preserve life, whether it's David and his men's life or whether it's Ahimelech's life there that is being protected. So that's what we have there. If that's not hard enough to navigate of what is going on with David, David then, we read in the next thing that he flees to Achish, the king of Gath. Now this is just a mind-blowing occurrence. So Gath is one of the 5 principalities of the Philistines and the hometown of Goliath. David, being the victor who slayed Goliath, who is an enemy of the Philistines, it seems awkward or strange to us that David's going to flee to the Philistines for refuge, to the city of their big victor Goliath. And what does he have in his hand as he's fleeing to that city? Goliath's own sword. Now again, we don't know. We know that the spear of Goliath was mentioned for its extraordinary length and size. We don't really hear that with his sword, so there might not have been anything about Goliath's sword that people would have looked at and said, oh, that's Goliath. So he might have been able to blend in a little bit with the sword. But it is interesting, all those connections, and a lot of it is just our misunderstanding of how the ancient world worked back in those days and how it was common to flee to other nations when you became wrong with your government and how they would take you in. And so it's a strange concept, but it really wasn't as strange during that time that he would flee to Gath there. But he goes there, and the servants of Achish notice David, and they say to themselves, hey, isn't this the one whom they sang in those dances about? Saul has struck down his thousands and David his tens of thousands. I feel bad for David. This song has got him into more trouble. This is what roused up the jealousy of Saul to David the first time, and now we have the servants of Achish recognizing this song to not want David in their territory. It makes you kind of wonder if the song did more harm than good for David. So they decide, hey, we need to bring this up to the king, saying this guy is no good guy to have in our territory, whether they're thinking he's a spy or just saying we need to get rid of him. He slayed multitudes of our people. And so they bring him before Achish, and so David is in waiting in a room, and so he gets the bright idea of, I'm going to act insane here. And so he starts scratching up the gates and the doors with his fingers. He lets saliva run down his beard. So when the servants bring him before Achish, Achish looks at him and goes, why are you bringing this madman before me? I have enough madmen in my country. And he does not allow him to come into his presence. And so David is delivered from the hand of the Philistines here by acting insane. I find it interesting. I always laugh thinking, if somebody was lurking outside my house and I felt like they were robbing, how great of a method that probably would be to run up to your window acting all crazy and bizarre and slamming up against the window. And they're either going to shoot you out of fear or they're going to take off running from what's going on here. But all that aside, we have to ask ourselves, was David right or wrong to pretend to be mad here? Last week we looked at the entirety of God's love and that we need to take account everything in order to determine what it is that God would want us to do in a certain situation. That we can't pick and choose scriptures that relate to the situation to determine what God's desired response would be from us. So I want to illustrate this again with this particular text of David pretending to be insane. Some people could make the claim David was weak in his faith. According to Proverbs 29, verse 25, the fear of man lays a snare, but whoever trusts in Yahweh is safe. And David laid a snare for himself because he let fear make him act like he was insane. He did something that was disrespectful in this culture. You did not disrespect your beard in that culture. To let saliva down on it was a horrid thing. And that's why everybody just assumed he was mad. You didn't do that. You didn't cut your beard, let alone let saliva run down it. So David just makes a mockery of himself. He doesn't trust in the Lord there. And it's just a trap for him. And it's by the grace of God that God lets him out of that situation. That he fled to the Philistines. He should have never done that out of fear. All those things that they put into account. David should have trusted God to protect him, they would say. David allowed sin to influence him and his sin by lying. And so they say this is a bad place of David's walk with the Lord here. But others can look at what David did and say what David did was the right thing to do. According to Proverbs 22, verse 3, the prudent sees danger and hides himself, but the simple go on and suffer for it. So David recognized there is danger here. I am going to be slain by the Philistines because they know who I am. So in recognizing that, he chooses to hide himself. I'm going to protect myself. And how am I going to protect myself? If I act insane, I'm not going to be looked at as a threat. But if David wasn't wise like that and just stood before them, he might have been killed. Because God doesn't protect all his chosen people. He does allow them to be killed. Jonathan, in the future, a righteous man, following David, is going to be killed in battle. God doesn't choose to protect him. So, which position's right? Was David right or was he wrong with what he did? Is the Bible contradicting itself? Well, of course not. This problem that we have in our mind, was David right or wrong? This problem arose because we're not taking everything into account. We're not factoring in all the details. We're just looking at it through two different Bible verses. We need to be looking at and asking ourselves, what was the purpose of David acting insane? What was the heart issue behind that? What was God's response to David acting insane? What else does the Bible say about the prudent and danger? What else does the Bible say about trusting in Yahweh? How does the Bible distinguish between lying, bearing false witness, protection, and pride? And are there other passages that are referenced in this, that reference this account? And in this case, there are, and over the next few weeks we'll be looking at those, and those are going to help give us a greater detail of what is going on inside this narrative. So we're not going to get all the answers this week. It's more important, I think, for us to ponder these things. I want us to be honest with ourselves of what is our initial reaction to what David has done with lying to Ahimelech and acting insane before the king. And then we're going to be looking over the next few weeks as more of this information comes in, and hopefully it'll clarify in our minds a little bit more of what's going on in this narrative. And if we can understand it here, then we're going to understand it in other people's lives as well. When there's information that seems one way from the outside when we look at it, but recognizing that maybe there's more details when we get looking on the inside that can help us better understand why things are being done the way that they are. But the narrative then goes on that he escapes there, and so then he escapes to the caves of Adullam. And while he's there, in 1 Samuel 22, verse 2, we read, "And everyone who is in distress, and everyone who is in debt, and everyone who is bitter in soul, gathered to him, and he became commander over them. And there was with him about 400 men. So David does have these guys that he has lined up to meet with, and other people are coming to come and to follow David during this time in these caves. And then we read about David going to Moab, and he sets his family up in Moab for protection, knowing that Saul was going to be seeking revenge from David. So he takes his family out of Israel and puts them in another country for protection. And then in verse 6 of chapter 22, we read of Saul learning of David's escape and how Jonathan had helped him out. And Saul asks, "Are you guys all conspiring against me?" And there's this one individual that steps up, and guess who it is? Doeg. Doeg comes up and says, "Wait a minute, I've seen David talking to Ahimelech." Or sorry, not Ahimelech. Ahimelech. Too many A names in this passage. Ahimelech. And he says in verse 9, "Then answered Doeg the Edomite, who stood by the servants of Saul, I saw the son of Jesse coming to Moab, to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. And he inquired of Yahweh for him, and gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine." So it's interesting here, Doeg tells us that Ahimelech inquired of the Lord for David. Again, we're not told what was the inquiring of the Lord, but a lot of times it was seeking God to say, "Are you going to prosper my endeavor of what I'm going to do?" Again, we're not told this in the text, but that was usually the case. So that might have been what the inquiring of the Lord was, and if so, that kind of helps us understand maybe why Ahimelech was so willing to give the bread to David and also to give the sword to him, because God had told Ahimelech, "Yes, I'm prospering what David is about ready to go and do." So Ahimelech felt comfortable, okay, this bread is only for the priest, but if God's prospering this guy's journey, he must be in the will of the Lord, therefore I can give him this food because of that life being more valuable sometimes than rules. My heart goes out for Ahimelech. Those of us that are navigating with this COVID thing on when to open and how to open, and do we wear masks, do we not wear masks, how do we handle social distancing, all those things are such a burden on the soul of trying to navigate and figure out. And my heart goes for Ahimelech. He has the same thing as he's trying to determine David with his request of this bread. He's trying to figure out what is going on behind the scenes here. What's the best thing? What is it that God wants me to do in this moment? And Ahimelech can't tell David, "Come back in 5 days, let me pray about it and see what the Lord's will is." Now the guy is starving to death. Ahimelech has to make that decision then and there. And that's why it's so important to have a walk with God in such a way that we have a heart like God's heart. Because we don't always have the time to say, "I'm going to take 5 days and pray about this." Sometimes in the heat of the moment, we have to be able to know, what is it that God's going to want me to do here? We don't have time to be looking up scripture and things like that. But if God dwells in our hearts and we've allowed him to work in our hearts and to prepare us for the future, then we're going to be more apt to be able to make the decisions that we need to make in the moment, like Ahimelech had to do here. So, he inquired of the Lord there, so Doeg says those things. So, Saul sends for Ahimelech, he questions Ahimelech, and Ahimelech tells his innocence, going, "This is what David told me, I don't know anything going on," and he even kind of talks about the character of David. "David has been loyal to you, Saul. I've inquired for David before, I have no idea why this is an issue." But Saul, in his rage, says, no, that the Ahimelech and his family are to be killed. And the servants of Saul say, we're not going to kill God's priest. A very righteous stance for them to take. But guess who's there to say, "Oh, I'll do it." Doeg stands forth and says, "I'll kill him." So he kills Ahimelech, kills his family, he kills 85 priests in all. But he doesn't stop there. He takes the city of Nob and puts all the men, women, and children and their livestock to the sword as well, and massacres that city. Just a deplorable thing for anybody to do, but especially an Edomite who is a relative to the Israelite people. So we see the the deranged mind of both Saul and Doeg here. And it's a sad thing. And hopefully we don't have those types of people in the church, but it is important for us to remember. Doeg was there at the presence of the tabernacle of God when David was there, worshiping God. But he goes out and does these things. And we do have to remember there are wolves in sheep's clothing, and not everybody that's at the church is a good individual. And I'm not speaking of our church, but I mean the church corporately. I mean, God even had to remind his people in Jeremiah 7, verses 9 through 11. Will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, make offerings to Baal, and go after other gods that you have not known, and then come and stand before me in this house, which is called by my name, and say, we are delivered? Only to go and do those abominations? Has this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your eyes? Behold, I myself have seen it, declares the Lord. So God brings up here that this, to worship him, but to follow ways that are contrary to him is an abomination to him. But it can be an encouragement to us when we see that and our heart breaks, when we see the pastor that's just out there to gain more money, or the pastor that's out there who's molested children or has committed adultery into his life, that God sees that and they are going to be called to account for that before the judgment seat. And that's why God warns us in Matthew 15:8. There are people who honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And so we do have to be careful. Not everybody that's in the church building is necessarily at the same walk with the Lord. Some are still growing, and that's an okay process. And there are some wolves in sheep's clothing that are there for the wrong reasons, and we have to be very careful with it. And it's not just pastors and priests, it's the attenders too that we can be careful, or we need to be watchful of, that we see here with Doeg and what he's done. So Doeg strikes all those people down. And then we read in verse, starting in 20, that there is one individual who escapes from Ahimelech's family, Ahithob. The son of Ahithob, named Abiathar. Abiathar is able to escape to David, and we read in verse 21 of chapter 22, and Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priest of Yahweh. And David said to Abiathar, I knew on that day, when I saw Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul, I have occasioned the death of all the persons of your father's house. We see the agony in David's heart of feeling the responsibility of causing the death of all these individuals. He's like, I knew when I seen Doeg this was not going to be a good thing. And he's probably questioning the decisions that he had made. But Abiathar is going to be a big piece in David's life, and he's a big piece prophetically. Abiathar, in the future, he's going to be with David. When David brings the ark into Jerusalem, he is one of the counselors of David. When one of David's sons, Absalom, rebels against him, it is Abiathar who stays in Jerusalem and kind of helps communicate back and forth what's happening in Jerusalem and what Absalom is doing. But he makes one critical mistake at the end of his career. And when David is about ready to die, Solomon is supposed to be king after David. But Adonijah decides to take this title on himself. And he gathers key individuals, and Abiathar is one of them that supports then Adonijah being king instead of Solomon. So David then takes a stand and says, wait, no, Solomon's supposed to be it. So he creates this big fanfare for Solomon. The people hear a bit of Abiathar's line and they kind of disperse. So when Solomon becomes king then, he removes Abiathar from the place of his priesthood because of this disgrace that he did, and he gives the priesthood to Zadok. And why that's important is it because it fulfills a prophecy that was given by God to Eli the priest back in the past. Eli had wicked sons, and they were profaning God's worship. They were choosing the best meats for themselves instead of for the sacrifices. They were being harsh towards the people. And Eli, as the high priest, was not reprimanding his sons. He was allowing them to do that. And so back in 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 27, and we can read some of this details in 1 Samuel chapter 2, verses 27 through verse 36, of God telling Eli, your descendants are not going to be able to be my high priest forever. I'm going to kill your 2 sons, and I'm going to rip the priesthood from your family. And Abiathar was the last of Eli's descendants who sat in the position of being high priest. Because of his sin, it was ripped from Eli's family and went to Zadok's family. And so there's a lot of dynamics that were going on there in the background of what God was playing out with Abiathar. So he's a great friend and loyal to David, but he does fulfill prophecy by making a big mistake. So that's the basics of the narrative that we need to have on the back burner on our mind. We'll bring these up in the coming weeks as we reference the Psalms, but it's important to have the background information so we can understand that. So there's a lot of high points and low points in David's life we see here. He has a great friendship with Jonathan. He has a great ally in Abiathar. But there's some trials that are going on in David's life. He fears for his life from Saul. He's fearing for his life from the Philistines. But he's rewarded with Goliath's sword. He's rewarded with getting the bread. He has the 500 or the 400 people that come to him that are down and outs of society. So all these things are going to come into play as we look at the Psalms in the coming weeks. So feel free to read over these verses more, contemplate these things, and remember, kind of think through too for our own application of how do you feel about what David has done, and be honest with yourself without knowing all the details. What's your initial reaction? What do you feel about him lying to Ahimelech? What do you feel about him having the bread that only the priests were to eat? What do you feel about him acting insane before the Philistine king? Thank you for taking this time to be with us. I pray that you have a blessed rest of the week.